Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park historian Jim Ogden stands in uniform of a tan flat hat, gray shirt, and green trousers. He stands in a gravel parking lot. Behind him is a thick wooded area and an iron gate over a gravel road.
Welcome back, or thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in for this program that the National Military Park is presenting this year to virtually recognize the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. This is the second of 6 programs that I am doing. And for those of you all who were able to tune in this morning, we started off talking about the plans and expectations by the two Army commanders for events on this date, Friday, September 18, 1863. And we're now going to move forward to the afternoon and really talk about the fighting of that day, the Battle of the Crossings. One of the things that doesn't perhaps get the attention that it should in the story of the Battle of Chickamauga, particularly for those who visit the battlefield at this time, is the role and significance of West Chickamauga Creek itself. That water course certainly gives its name to the battle, and its already existing sobriquet or nickname, the River of Death, only added to the sense of how significant and costly this battle did indeed become. Today, in your basic visit or tour to the battlefield, it is more of a challenge, a little bit of an extra effort to actually get to the banks of West Chickamauga Creek. Presently, the National Military Park does not have a basic tour stop on the banks of the creek, but hopefully in the coming years, through the assistance of the Battlefield Preservation Organization, now American Battlefield Trust, that a visit to the creek will be made easier. For our afternoon's discussion about the Battle of the Crossings, we're going to actually walk down and look at one of the crossings on West Chickamauga Creek that is more difficult to actually access. I'm going to go down to the area of Dalton and Thedford's Ford. These crossing points, essentially in the southern or southeastern portion of the Chickamauga battlefield, are accessed today off of Alexander Vineyard Road, along which we stand, at a parking lot here, at a gate and a gravel road that leads south from Alexander Vineyard Road. The road network right at this point is similar to what it was in 1863, but not exactly. The intersection of this gravel road and the Alexander Vineyard Road today is simplified. It was more complex, almost a series of crosses and X to facilitate travel in multiple directions. But this gravel road behind me still does lead down towards those two important crossing points over West Chickamauga Creek. So join me this afternoon as we go down to the banks of West Chickamauga Creek.
Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park historian Jim Ogden stands front-facing in uniform of a tan flat hat, gray shirt, and green trousers. He stands on the bank of a wide flowing creek. Across the creek, the other bank is covered in heavy vegetation.
Welcome back after our brief pause. As you can see, we have moved from the gate leading down to Dalton and Thedford's Ford on the Alexander Vineyard Road, and we have now moved down here to the banks of West Chickamauga Creek itself. And we have particularly come to Dalton's Ford, also known as Hunt's Ford, based primarily on the residents who lived on either side of the creek at this point. Two Hunt families, Helm and Jephthah Hunt, living on the north side or the Chickamauga battlefield side of the creek here at Dalton or Hunt's Ford, and Booth Dalton living on the south side of the creek at this point. As discussed in our presentation this morning, as part of Bragg's plan to interpose his Army of Tennessee between the Union Army of the Cumberland as it marches north-northeastward out of the mountains and McLemore's Cove, marching northward to get back up towards Chattanooga. And the city of Chattanooga itself. One of the first things that Braxton Bragg was going to have to do was to cross West Chickamauga Creek. And in the first versions of Bragg's orders, as he developed this plan and issued the orders for its implementation on September the 16th and 17th and 18th, he emphasized a little bit more in those first versions of the order the importance of gaining control, seizing these crossings on West Chickamauga Creek. As you look at West Chickamauga Creek on a period map or on even a modern USGS topographic map, and certainly on many of the online mapping programs today, which are based on aerial photographs, one thing that is difficult to fully appreciate is just how much a potential military obstacle West Chickamauga Creek is, as it snakes its way from south to north, really from south-southwest to north-northeast. Its headwaters being down in McLemore's Cove at the same place where Missionary Ridge begins, and where elements of these two armies had already dealt with both Missionary Ridge and West Chickamauga Creek in the second week of September of 1863. The creek, as it winds its way north-northeastward, it has carved itself down into the geology of this area, those layers upon layers of limestone that make up the mountains as we see them today, or really the valleys that have been carved down into the floor of the old Great Sea. And this creek, as it winds its way north-northeastward, having carved itself down into that limestone, winds up along most of its lengths with very steep, sharp, well-defined banks. Those banks make it difficult to cross the creek just at any point, particularly if you have an organized body of troops or in particular wheeled vehicles, whether we're talking about horse and mule drawn vehicles of the mid-19th century or even modern wheeled vehicles as well. Individuals can potentially find a way into and out of the creek on either side, and potentially find a place to cross, but that can be a time-consuming and slow process. In Bragg's desire to move expeditiously up from the south, southeast, and east, and then begin to get elements of his army in between the Union Army and Chattanooga, crossing West Chickamauga Creek would be a key. And because of the steep, sharp bank nature of that winding and in 1863 relatively sluggish creek, sluggish at that time because of the effects of the year-long drought, which reduced the water level in the creek, Bragg had to identify potential crossing points. And in the first versions of this plan or order, Bragg had even directed his cavalry to seize those potential crossing points. Since the main maneuver element of Bragg's plan would be crossing the creek to the northeast of Lee and Gordon's Mill, or downstream of Lee and Gordon's Mill, identified in Bragg's plan would be crossings of the creek here at Dalton's or Hunt's Ford, then next downstream at Thedford's Ford, and then at Alexander's Bridge, and further downstream at Reed's Bridge, with the potential also of crossings as far north as Dyer's Bridge and Dyer's Ford, north of Reed's Bridge, and identifying also the possibility of having to use intermediate fords as well, like Byram's or Lambert's Ford. The two of Bragg's 5 columns will be directed to cross the creek at the bridge sites themselves, Reed's Bridge and Alexander's Bridge. You heard a little bit this morning from Lee White about the fighting for or between Bushrod Johnson and Robert Minty on the Reed's Bridge Road for control of that crossing. But in addition to those bridge crossings, Bragg had also identified fords. Fords are places where the bank of the creek is sloped down or capable of being sloped down to allow relatively easy access into the water and out of the water on the other side, where the bottom of the watercourse itself is solid enough to support the weight of whatever it is you're going to cross, and where the depth of the water is a factor. Now, the depth of the water can indeed vary, and that variance is based usually on what is going to cross at the ford. For an all-purpose military ford of the Civil War period, the water could be no greater than 30 inches, because at 32 inches, you start to reach the load-bearing surface of the wheeled vehicles of that day, the wagons, limbers, and caissons. Infantry soldiers could indeed potentially ford greater than 30 inches of water. And if you read enough soldier accounts from the war, and you read those various ford crossings at different places, you will find soldiers that report fording water anywhere from ankle to calf to knee to waist to chest, or even neck deep. It is, though, one important thing to remember, that you need to factor in the height of the soldier. A taller soldier can conceivably ford a greater depth of water. Cavalrymen, of course, on the backs of their horses, could ford at places where even for a short distance the horse might have to swim. Also a factor is the speed of the water. The greater the speed might necessitate the need for an upstream entrance and a downstream exit to compensate for the push of whatever is crossing downstream by the actual current of the water itself. You also have to be concerned about the material of the banks, so that it doesn't get churned into a slick, low traction mud, particularly on the exit side. And so as Bragg developed this plan, he will designate troops to cross at not only the bridge sites like Reed's Bridge and Alexander's Bridge, but also here at ford sites. And in particular here at Thedford's Ford downstream or to the east of where we are right now, and here at Dalton's or Hunt's Ford the two divisions of Simon Bolivar Buckner's Corps of Bragg's Army will be directed to cross. Buckner will send the division that he has only recently received command of, having been detached by Bragg from its normal alignment within the Army, and given to Buckner, the division of Alexander Peter Stewart. Buckner will send Stewart's division towards Thedford's Ford. Buckner, with Preston's division, William Preston's division, troops of the District or Department of East Tennessee that Buckner normally command, those troops will be directed to come here to Dalton and Hunts Ford to cross. Now, as noted this morning, in addition to Bragg having developed this plan, his opponent, William Stark Rosecrans, had done and continued to do one of those most important things that a military commander must do, and that is always be evaluating the situation for not only your own opportunities, but also to try to divine what it is your enemy might be doing as well. And as noted, Rosecrans had conceived the possibility that Bragg might try to cross West Chickamauga Creek downstream of Thomas Crittenden's 21st Corps, upstream from here at Lee and Gordon's Mill. And as troops had become available, Rosecrans had positioned those troops to watch the crossings. We heard again this morning about Minty's brigade making contact, detecting the Confederate advance on the Reed's Bridge Road, and then fighting to delay that Confederate column. On September the 17th, when John Thomas Wilder's brigade of mounted infantry, armed with the Spencer repeating rifle largely, when that brigade had become available to Rosecrans once again, Rosecrans moved Wilder's brigade to a position along West Chickamauga Creek between Minty on the Reed's Bridge Road and Crittenden at Lee and Gordon's Mill, and Wilder was sent specifically to the bridge crossing site at Alexander's Bridge. And he deployed his troops to guard that crossing, and as Minty had done before him, Wilder then sent troops to guard the adjacent up and downstream ford sites. The bridge crossing sites are higher speed avenues of crossing over the creek than a ford is. And so the main defense would be at those bridge sites with smaller bodies of troops to watch the actual ford sites. And Wilder's men or elements of that force were picketing, guarding this site, and in the hours before the Confederate approach, their scouts had been on the other side of the creek as well to detect the approach of the Confederates. As the Confederates do approach at both Thedford's Ford and here at Dalton or Hunts Ford, Wilder's scouts on the other side of the creek will fall back. And as Stewart with William Bates' brigade in the lead at Thedford's Ford, and William Preston with Kelly's brigade in the lead here at Dalton or Hunts Ford, as they approach the creek, they, and including the small Confederate cavalry detachment helping to screen their advance, will detect Union troops in position on the other side of the creek. At Thedford's Ford, Stewart orders Bates' lead brigade to progress just a little bit further downstream and then deploy on a wooded rise overlooking the downstream side of Thedford's Ford. This is still on the east or other side of West Chickamauga Creek. but it is a position that does offer observation and potentially some field of fire to the forward crossing site itself, should it be necessary to fight to gain that crossing. The 2nd Brigade in Stewart's column, the brigade of Henry Clayton, Alabamans, a relatively new brigade within Bragg's army. That brigade arrives and is deployed on a wooded rise on the upstream side of Thedford's Ford. And both Bate and Clayton will deploy forward some troops as skirmishers. In particular, Bate will send his 4th Georgia Battalion of sharpshooters out to screen his front and to make contact with the Federals on the other side. Bate will also order his attached artillery battery, the Eufaula Light Artillery from Eufaula, Alabama, to move forward, and the Eufaula battery will take position on an open rise, and as an indication of just how much open ground there was at the time in the valley of West Chickamauga Creek, as Bate's men deploy on the downstream side of Thedford's Ford, about a mile away to the north, overlooking the big open fields at Alexander's Bridge. Bate and Stewart can see some of Wilder's troops in position at Alexander's Bridge. And as Bate's skirmishers deploy, shots begin to be exchanged with the Federals on the other side of the creek, and the Eufaula artillery battery will fire, or will have a short duel with some of Eli Lilly's guns at the Alexander House site above Alexander's Bridge. One of the other things that looking at these crossings of the creek, particularly here at Thedford's and Dalton's Ford, and relative to Bragg's order, one of the additional things it allows us to see is a little bit more about Bragg's thinking, and in particular the sequencing of his advance. Bragg did envision these 5 columns crossing the creek essentially as a big left wheel, once on the west side of the creek, moving southwestward to strike the Union left flank at Lee and Gordon's Mill. But also he envisioned that that this crossing would be in such a sequence that Bushrod Johnson or Hood's column at Reed's Bridge would cross first, then William Henry Talbot Walker's troops at Alexander's Bridge, or if necessary, Byram or Lambert's Ford, and then Buckner's troops would cross. And Buckner had made that clear to Stewart, both Stewart and Bate relating that they had been ordered that while they were to take position to command and potentially seize Thedford's Ford, they were not to bring on an engagement. The expectation being that the crossings further downstream or to the north would occur first, and then Buckner's 2 divisions would cross. As the fight develops that afternoon, the most intense action will be at Alexander's Bridge for a short time. There, at the time of the war, on the west or Chickamauga battlefield side of the creek at Alexander's Bridge were some large open agricultural fields that stretched from the bank of the creek all the way to the top, or all the way to the rise at the intersection of Alexander Vineyard Road and Alexander Bridge Road. And there at that intersection stood the large farmstead that had been John P. Alexander's. And where the woods began again on the top of that rise is where Wilder had put the main body of his troops. He, as a result of the threat to Minty's brigade at Reed's Bridge, had sent 2 of his 5 regiments, or on that day, the 4 available ones. He'd sent 2 of those regiments, the 72nd Indiana and the 123rd Illinois, as well as 2 of Lilly's guns to assist Minty potentially in holding Reed's Bridge. And this left Wilder with just the 17th Indiana, his own regiment, and the 98th Illinois Infantry. And their main position being up near the crest of the rise. Some troops were deployed along the vegetation at the bank of the creek, and detached from the 72nd Indiana was Company A of that regiment, positioned behind the planks of the road deck of Alexander's Bridge that had been loosened and pulled up and piled on Wilder's side of the creek. About 2 o'clock, after Walker's column had closed up at Alexander's Bridge, Shot Pouch Walker will order St. John Liddell to send forward one of his brigades. Edward Carey Walthal's Mississippi Brigade will be tapped, and that 5-regiment Mississippi Brigade will form line of battle and advance towards Alexander's Bridge with the hope of driving whatever federal force on the other side away so that they can seize that critical crossing. But as they advance, they come under fire of first the 4 guns of Eli Lilly's 18th Indiana Battery, positioned around the buildings of the Alexander Farmstead, and then of the Spencer repeating rifle armed men of the 98th Illinois and 17th Indiana, deployed along the banks of the creek. And then as they get closer, the main bodies of Wilder's force there at the bridge will open fire as well. And there is just a brief fight of about 15 minutes' time, in which Wilder's men inflict 105 casualties on the almost 1,800 Mississippians and convince Walthall, Liddell, and Walker that crossing the creek at Alexander's Bridge is not going to be feasible under that fire. Walker, already advised of the potential of crossing downstream at Byram's and Lambert's Ford, will divert towards that crossing about a mile further downstream and will eventually cross the creek at that point. But Byram's and Lambert's Ford is a more difficult ford than here, certainly at Hunt or Dalton's Ford, and the greater distance to march to it and from it, and the difficulty of crossing is going to further delay Bragg's effort to interpose elements of his army between the Union Army and Chattanooga. And in fact, it will not be until after dawn on the morning of September the 19th that all of Walker's troops will get across the creek at Byram's or Lambert's Ford. Here at Thedford's Ford downstream, and here at Dalton and Hunt's Ford, even though Stewart's and Preston's troops have moved up into positions to command these ford crossings and potentially strike to seize them, there is not initially any significant action. That is again because of the directive from Buckner to not bring on any engagement. Again, the expectation by Bragg that the crossings further to the north or downstream would occur first. However, in late afternoon, as unrealized by Buckner, Stewart, and Preston, and Bate and Kelly and others. Wilder's men withdraw as Wilder is forced to abandon his position at Alexander's Bridge, when Minty is forced to give up Reed's Bridge. This then will allow Stewart and Preston to actually seize the west or north bank of the creek at these two crossing sites. Late that afternoon and into the evening, Clayton's Alabama Brigade will send first its skirmishers over the creek from the 18th Alabama Infantry, and then the rest of Clayton's brigade and its attached battery, Humphreys Arkansas Battery, will cross the creek and take position on a rise on the north or west side of West Chickamauga Creek at Thedford's Ford. Here at Dalton or Hunt's Ford, there is some brief skirmishing between Wilder's men on the north side of the creek and Preston's on the south side. And then late in the day, Archibald Gracie's Alabama and Tennessee Brigade will ford the creek and deploy in the large Hunt cornfield on the north side of the creek. And so by dark on September the 18th, the Confederates will indeed have seized the crossings of West Chickamauga Creek at Reed's Bridge and at Alexander's Bridge and at Thedford's Ford and here at Dalton or Hunt's Ford. But this was something that Bragg had hoped they would accomplish by midday, by mid-morning. But now, as a result of these issues, with the distribution of Bragg's orders and the resistance from the Federals, the crossings, which Bragg had hoped would occur in mid-morning, have only actually occurred by the end of the day. And even then, not fully completed, because Stewart's and Preston's men will spend the night unaware that bivouacking in front of them to the north along Alexander Vineyard Road are the elements of John Bell Hood's column that had crossed at Reed's Bridge that afternoon and advanced down onto the Alexander Vineyard Road. The walk down here to the banks of West Chickamauga Creek at either Thedford's Ford or Dalton or Hunt's Ford, and a consideration of the geology and geography of this creek gives a greater appreciation for just what an obstacle this creek is and how important this battle for the crossings on September the 18th is in determining the eventual outcome of what became the Battle of Chickamauga.